Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day for this Artists' Rights Institute podcast with our friend Helienne Lindvall. Helienne, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you come to be where you are?
Sure. I started out as an artist, a performing artist in music, a session singer, and but I always wrote music for myself. And then, sort of in my late 20s, I started writing for other people. I got my first publishing deal with an independent that then was bought by a major. And so I kind of experienced a lot of the different go arounds that happens as a songwriter with my copyright being traded. And after a while, I started writing a column for The Guardian about the music industry. And it's too long of a story to say how I happened to do that. But then when I did that, because I'm based in the UK now, I'm Swedish, lived in New York, hence my accent, and then moved to London. I guess I've got like a slight British accent now. Not really. But so I started writing for The Guardian, and I realized that the issues that existed within the music industry ran a lot deeper and were a lot broader than I'd kind of realized. And at the time, it was mostly about piracy. Then streaming came along, and then the royalty distribution of streaming. And then, that led into AI eventually. I got involved in advocacy, and I worked with the Ivors Academy, which was then called BASCA, the British Academy of Songwriters and Composers, and was elected onto the board as a director and was there for quite a while. And that led me to represent them at ECSA, which is the European Composer and Songwriter Alliance. And a bit more than 3 years ago, I was elected president of that organization. So I feel very, very passionately about creators' rights. I still write music, because if I didn't do that, I'd probably kind of like lose my will to do any of this stuff. And I need to be reminded, obviously, why I do it. And I love writing music, and I work with artists on both sides of the Atlantic still. I'm actually just starting to work with a Ukrainian act, which is quite exciting.
Awesome. Well, so that role recently took you to Brussels, I think, regarding various aspects of the implementation of the EU AI Act, right? And that's basically what that was about. So just so everybody understands how it works in Europe, there's, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but there's sort of an EU level legislation where the members of the EU Parliament, which is a separate body from individual national legislatures, vote on and craft and draft various legislation. In this case, the AI Act, what they call the AI Act. And then that legislation has to be implemented at the national level because the European Union or the European Parliament doesn't have direct jurisdiction over any one European, right? So it has to go through, in order to have effect over anyone, it has to go into effect through the national legislatures. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so basically how the EU works in on a broader, just to explain the democracy of the EU, because sometimes people are like, oh, it's unelected bureaucrats. Actually, they're all elected. If you didn't participate in the election, then that's on you. But every country has EU elections, every EU country, and we elect our representatives.
Right.
And what tends to happen sometimes is that because the EU doesn't it doesn't decide tax laws or things like that. That in general is it's obviously decided by each member state separately. People sometimes vote for more extreme parties, or is the reason why the Pirate Party existed in the EU among Parliament, because you might not want the Pirate Party to like run your government in your country, but you might, you know, some people wanted people to push that agenda within the EU.
So they have
So,
proportional representation.
proportional representation, and then on top of the parliament, which votes on acts and everything, there's the EU Commission.
Right.
So Ursula von der Leyen, who you see a lot, she's the one she's the president of the Commission. So you see her kind of represent the EU a lot, but that is more of a kind of something that sits on top of it, and they work out proposals. So the copyright directive, which was implemented back in 2019, and it took years to kind of work that out. There's like different renditions of it that get voted through, and then another one, and then another one, and finally you get the act. And it took years to get the Copyright Act, and which was really, really strong for creators.
Right.
It enabled us to renegotiate our contracts. It had Article 17 that some people called very controversial, because it actually required platforms to be responsible for what is uploaded on their platforms, like the YouTubes and whatever of this world. Which, and this will kind of have something to do when we come to the AI.
Yes, exactly.
Because this is why I feel like where we are now with AI is a deja vu for me. First of all, with the Copyright Act, when they say Article 17 is going to break the internet, you're not going to have any YouTube, it's not going to function. Article 17 was implemented. As you can see, we're sitting here, you know, I can use YouTube, whatever.
The sun rose in the east after all.
They just want an easy life, and they don't want to pay for stuff. Right. That's what it is.
So with that, with just so for people who are watching, if you followed the Music Tech Policy or the Tricortis blogs back in 2019, we had a lot of discussion about this Article 17. And David Lowery was involved with kind of drilling down on some of the more AstroTurf aspects of this whole thing. So carry on.
Yeah.
But
Google,
this is where Google was heavily involved with lobbying, like they are now,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
With AI.
So they have a lot of lobbyists in Brussels and Strasbourg, which is the other where they've got some of the EU Parliament. And then we had GDPR, which also has something to do with AI, right. In the sense of that's the privacy. If anybody's traveled to Europe, they will see when they use their phone, anytime they log on to a website or whatever, you have to give okay for cookies, because they can't just place cookies on your web browsing in Europe. And that's part of the GDPR, which is a privacy regulation. Again, all the tech companies said it's going to break the internet, not going to work. We're not going to be able to operate in Europe anymore. As you can tell, you know, we can still use the internet. So then we get into AI, and we get the same story again. It's impossible to know what we've hoovered up.
Well, let's talk about that. So one of the there's sort of two things going on, which I think people may not really have focused on, right? Or not sufficiently anyway. One is this hoovering up aspect, right? There's a lot of talk in AI circles about fixing, you know, like protecting creators and protecting privacy, and as if that's something that's going to happen in the future, right? You know, the truth is these people at the tech companies, and it really is these people. It's about the same five companies that have been doing this, that have been creating trouble for us for 25 years now. Um, these people have been literally, and you say hoovering up, that's literally what they're doing. They are, because AI as a technology requires so much data, right? They have literally been scooping up data everywhere they can get it, which is basically everywhere that's not nailed down. And it doesn't really matter if you have a statement in your terms of service, that says, I don't want my website used for data scraping. If it's not behind a pretty aggressive paywall or some sort of subscription type interface that would prevent a crawler from getting in, they're taking it. And I know this because I've seen my own work show up, in AI results, which is kind of startling when it happens to you. So this has been going on for, I don't know, could be one way or another since the Google Books project, right? And Google Books itself was sort of the cornerstone of Google's AI training, which is basically all literature in the history of mankind.
Hmm.
So that's already in there. So when we talk about AI protections, it's not something that is going to stop what they've already done. And I don't think, and I'd be interested in your reaction to that, but I don't think they intend to do anything about what they've already done. And I really don't think they intend to limit themselves in any way going forward. And the way they're doing it is they have, legally speaking, is they have sprinkled around the world in their global lobbying efforts, this thing they call TDM, which is a text and data mining exception. And it started out as being this kind of very milquetoast, and apparently inobtrusive exception to copyright in a variety of places that had a very limited scope. But they have now tried to drive a Mack truck through it. Now, that's my impression of what's going on in Europe right now with the European AI Act. Do I have that right? Are they sort of hanging their hat on this TDM exception and trying to say it's broader than it ever was intended?
Yeah, so the TDM exception is in the copyright directive. So
Right.
that was passed in 2019, and it's in Article 4. So if you hear people talk about Article 4, and that's what it's about. And it is, if you read Article 4, it is supposed to be very limited text and data mining exception. So it's basically for some scientific research or library, which is being used a lot to drive a truck through copyright. But so that even when the people who worked on the copyright directive, there's an MEP called Axel Voss, who's been
Right.
very active both in the copyright directive and in the AI Act.
Oh, okay.
And
He's a good
he,
guy. Right.
yeah,
We like
he's a
him.
good guy, and he always says he was very instrumental in the copyright directive,
Right. I remember him.
in the committees that hammered that out. And it's a, believe it or not, in the EU, and I guess it's everywhere, it's a stressful job in the sense that when the copyright directive was being lobbied around, he and many MEPs had death threats
Yes.
from because of Article 17.
Serious. I mean,
Like some
serious death
MEPs had
threats.
to have
Yes.
some MEPs had to have like security detail
Right. Hmm. Right.
for this, for wanting to enforce copyright. And this is important to know, because this is also why a lot of, like, when the AI Act came in, when that started to get discussed, and the EU wanted to be in the forefront to legislate about AI. And I think that to a certain extent, they went so quickly because they wanted to be the first that they just said, okay, we don't want to in any way reopen the discussion about copyright So we just put in the AI Act that it has to, AI, generative AI has to comply with EU copyright law, i.e., with the copyright directive. And the copyright directive, is Article 4, which says that there's a TDM, text and data mining exemption, but there's an opportunity to opt out. So if you don't
spin
want
that
your,
out. Yeah.
So
Spin that
if
out.
you
What does that
don't
mean?
want your copyright material to be used for text and data mining, you can opt out. But it never really said anything about how to do that. And of course, because AI was not intended to be like part of Article 4, they didn't see a reason to kind of have to hammer out details about it, because they didn't foresee that it would be used in massive copyright infringement, bigger than anything we've ever seen before. And believe it or not, in 2019, because ChatGPT had not been launched, as far as I know, it was not even in discussion. And it's, just a few years later, clearly they were already hoovering up data at that point.
They had to be. Yeah, they had to be. Yeah, right.
And so the AI Act, which it was much quicker getting passed than our copyright directive, which took years to hammer out with all the details, did not want to reopen any discussion about copyright. And they kind of referred to the copyright directive. And that's how we got this whole big discussion on how is this going to be implemented.
And do they have, has there been a discussion now about this opt out? And I mean, I saw something from Axel Voss the other day saying that he had never intended, it was never the intention that TDM be used in this broad way and so on. Is that what's being talked about now?
Well, he says that. He said that what's interesting is there's you got the MEPs who sits on these committees. And a lot of them, he's not the only one, but because he's so kind of prominent in the sense of that he's been on the committee or headed committees in both of these acts. But there are other countries that also are questioning now if the exception should apply to AI. So I think Hungary had the presidency a few months ago. So different countries had the presidency of the EU for 6 months. So you go around, and Hungary asked member states for input on the AI Act, and several countries said that they questioned if the TDM exception should apply. I will say also that there is, of course, another agreement that not just the EU has signed, which is the Berne Convention, which says that you cannot use copyrighted works and without a license and then compete with the works that you've just stolen, if we speak bluntly.
Yes.
So and even the US has signed it. Most countries in the world have signed it, and clearly this contravenes all of those rules. It's the 3-step test that they say, to be able to have an exception.
So speaking of the Berne Convention and opt out, there's another provision of the Berne Convention that's pretty sensitive to folks outside the US. We have this bizarre copyright registration program here. So everyone who's an American who's listening to this, just put that out of your mind for a minute. That we're not concerned with that. But there is a provision in the Berne Convention about formalities that basically it's saying that I think the general idea is that any signatory can't impose formalities on any other signatory that would sort of interfere with their ability to enjoy their copyright rights. And to me, this whole opt-out thing implicates the formalities provisions of the Berne Convention. And I would think that that would be of concern to somebody, because I don't know how you can have an opt-out regime without having some kind of obligation to register something, come up with metadata for it, have some kind of descriptor, and if you don't opt out the way this is structured, if you don't opt out, then you basically lose your rights. And that seems to go directly against, the formalities provisions of the Berne Convention. So has that come up? I mean, are people
Well,
concerned about this?
the thing in Europe is that we don't have to, I know that in the States you have to like register to get your copyright. We don't have to do that actually. It's like your copyright, as soon as you have put something into a tangible medium, that is, you own that copyright.
Right. Well, and
there's a
that's
formality. There's a
just for-
formality to register it with PRS or STIM
Right.
or whatever your CMO is. But even if you don't, you still own that copyright.
Well, that's true in the US too. Just quickly for clarity, that's true in the US, except that if you want to enforce your rights,
Right.
you have to register. And
Yes.
then you also
But
get
you don't have
statutory
to.
damages and you get some benefits from doing that. But you don't actually technically have to register in order to have a copyright, which is interesting in and of itself because that brings up, baby pictures and, like all kinds of other things that are not, songs that are up there too that are also getting hoovered up.
Yeah.
But go on.
Yeah, well, I think so. So to kind of get back also to the what is happening in Europe
Yes.
and how it works with ECSA and our lobbying on this particular issue. We even though the AI Act was passed, now after last summer when it was passed, now we have to hammer out the rules of how is this going to happen. We, as an organization, ECSA, have said right from the start, we opt out does not work. It has to be opt in. Some organizations have kind of said, they've resigned themselves to like that that bus has left the station. We don't agree with that. We think that actually, if you actually look at how they're trying to implement the AI Act, it does not work. And there's so many flaws in it. And what we found in particular with AI is that we have allies across the industries. We have allies who are journalists, authors,
Right.
Film directors, actors, musicians. Like it's such a vast number of organizations that are being affected by the AI Act that our lobbying of the EU has really increased. Of course, so has the tech lobbies, and they do have a lot of money, clearly. What the EU is working on at the moment is a code of conduct for the general purpose AI company providers, as they call it, that they should sign with. Initially, the first draft had obligations for them publishing how much or what kind of copyright compliance they had, several different parts to kind of show that they were complying with EU copyright law.
So this would be voluntary? Is that what this is?
It's voluntary code of conduct. Okay. Yeah. So we're now on the third draft of this, and it's been watered down so much that the language now is they should be encouraged to follow EU copyright law. Like,
Yeah.
what on earth
Right.
is that? Like, how does that in any way help us? And
Well,
they
and the
should
brass,
make
the
reasonable
brass of
efforts. They should make reasonable efforts. This is the language that the third draft has.
yeah.
Reasonable efforts to ensure that whatever they hoovered up has not been copyright works that have been opted out, so to speak.
The brass of
And
these people is not to be underestimated, by the way. I mean, you have to say to yourself, if I were someone who knew that I'd been hoovering up all the world's copyrights, including, baby pictures, recipes, emails,
yeah,
if I was taking like, and there's a pretty good case that they have been using Gmail, your private Gmails. They'll always say, "Well, it's anonymized," and in Word documents from Word and various Google Docs and so on, right? That they've been doing this, and that you've been doing this, and then when someone calls you on it, you say, "Oh, well, I just want to be encouraged," to be. I mean, this requires a certain lack of self-awareness, and you might say greed.
yes, and this is
Greed.
what I so
Yes.
we had our creators conference, ECSA
Yes.
organizing a creators conference at the EU Parliament, and I was hosting it, but I also moderated the AI panel, and that's how
Huh.
I kind of started that panel. I said, it's not about innovation, it's about extraction.
Right.
It's not
Yep.
about the freedom of speech, because copyright, underpins freedom of speech.
Right.
Copyright underpins innovation.
Yep.
And they know it, because otherwise, why would Sam Altman, the boss of OpenAI, be up in arms when DeepSeek, when they accused DeepSeek of hoovering up their intellectual property? So
Yeah.
it's all about greed. It's
Yeah.
about not wanting to pay for technology, but that will operate, to have a proper infrastructure to license copyrighted works. And it's also about just not wanting to pay for the fuel for their engines.
Right.
I mean, as Ed Newton Rex says, they're willing to pay millions, hundreds of millions, for the AI talent, as in the programmers and the people who are operating these complicated works. And also, they're willing to pay millions for the GPUs that are used to work the data, but they want to pay nothing for
Right.
the actual data,
Right.
the fuel. And I mean, without data, AI doesn't exist. So, why should they not? And in particular, when it competes, clearly already competes
Yeah.
with the work that they're hoovering up for free.
Yeah. And it's also impossible. And they hold out these. This is sort of like content ID, to a certain extent. We've seen this movie before, and we know
Yeah,
how it ends. This is like DMCA. This is like all these safe harbors. Section in our country, it's
yeah,
Section 230 in the DMCA, and you have versions of that, in your around the world, and because they made damn sure that you do, and it always comes back to the same thing. They don't want to pay, or they want to pay what they want to pay, right?
yeah,
And this is the revenue share concept, right? Like, well, we'll put aside a pool of money, a pie. We'll give you a piece of the pie, right? Not what
yeah,
you asked for, right?
yeah.
Because that's
It's like
that's the other
YouTube. That's
aspect
what.
of this,
Yeah,
right? That's where I think that will ultimately be where it goes. I think ultimately they're going to lose this idea on this idea that they don't have to pay at all, right? But the way they're going to come back on it is they will use the YouTube precedent and other precedents, to say, well, we'll put aside this pool of money and we'll give you X% of that, right? And and take that, sign here, eat that, right? Basically. I mean that's what that's their MO. So
Yeah, I
with
mean,
the opt-out, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, what's interesting, because we already have the AI Act in within the EU, is that to preempt, that even the code of conduct and whatever, to make sure that we're exercising our rights. The most of the CMOs in Europe have already opted out of AI.
Right. And how do they do that? I mean,
GEMA has done
how would
it
they,
well.
how do they do that though? I mean,
So they're
if you're,
supposed to use this, and this is also so ridiculous. The scheme Robot X, which is first of all, it's not, it's very limiting to only have one system to be able to opt out.
which
And in
is
particular, when also
robots.txt.
according to the code of conduct, all you need to have is, make best efforts or
Right.
reasonable efforts to check it. But also, I mean, for these CMOs, they clearly, I mean, they own all or they represent rather the copyrights of all music creators in their respective countries. So if you've got all European,
it's a vast.
yeah, it's a vast. So if we take an example, like SACEM, which is the French CMO, they have done it. GEMA, the German CMO, they have gone even further. So they did right away when the AI Act was implemented. They were like, well, if you say that we got to opt out, well, that's what we do. And they've been very public with it, and they've informed the AI companies that anything that they represent, they've opted out from AI training. Of course, they're aware that all of this has already been hoovered up. So hence why GEMA has both set up a licensing structure. They already proposed a licensing structure of how to license AI input and output. And they've in their licenses program, GEMA would get 30% of the income from the AI. At the same time, they sued Suno and OpenAI and said,
Right.
you already have within your AI systems our copyrighted works.
Right.
We had at our AI panel at the EU Parliament, we had the chief legal representative from GEMA do a demo. She showed Forever Young with Alphaville. She does the big ones that GEMA represent, and Daddy Cool with what were they, Bonium, and then played what Suno had kind of spat back at them when they put a simple kind of
Right.
asking to the engine, and it was so almost identical.
Right.
So it's clear, and obviously in the US you have the major labels have got similar cases.
Well, and the reason this is an issue is because in order to make your case, I'm sure it's probably somewhat similar everywhere. In order to make a copyright infringement case, you have to be able to show which works were infringed. And normally you do that by, getting a specimen of the bootleg album or whatever it might be, right? And then it becomes obvious. When you go to after these guys, you go to them and you say, I want to know what of my works you took. And they'll say, oh, no, sorry, that's confidential, trade secret. Can't tell you. And that,
See, this is an interesting one too. The whole trade secret
yeah,
BS
yeah,
uh, is that, as we put it, we have rules about ingredients when it comes to food.
right, yes,
And to take an example, Coca-Cola, the most famous secret recipe, they still have to put the ingredients on the
right.
bottle of Coca-Cola.
That's a
You
good
can't just
point.
have a secret
Yeah,
recipe with whatever inside of it.
right,
So for them to put the ingredients that they hoovered up does not represent a trade secret in any way.
right.
It is, for
It,
me, that the some legislators and the commission and have can fall for something like that. It is beyond me.
right.
I think,
Often explained by bribes. You know?
yeah,
Uh,
or and I don't want to like specify, but we've had politicians that have gone from, like in the UK, we had Nick Clegg go
oh
from
yes.
being the
Uh-huh.
leader of the Liberal Democrats to being, the chief policy officer for Facebook,
Right,
now
yes.
Meta.
Yeah,
And I'm sure he got paid a lot more by Facebook.
yeah,
Uh,
right.
I'm not saying that that's all legislators. I think some legislators are um, some legislators actually think that Europe can somehow be in the forefront of AI training, when clearly, as in most online and internet tech ventures, you have kind of a very few. It's very high market concentration.
Right,
Um, because they also buy up companies
right.
at a you know at a rate never seen before.
Well, and
And
this is also part of, I mean, there's nothing like 25 years of lobbying, to sort of start changing people's minds, right? I mean, we don't really realize, I think, in America, just how broad their reach is around the world. They're everywhere. I
and
mean,
what
the
you
truth
have
is
is
they're
like,
everywhere.
and how it works in Europe a lot is they form think tanks. I don't know
Yes, of
if you have,
course.
yeah,
Yes.
think tanks in America, but the think tanks, which is basically, when if you look under the hood and you see who sponsors these think tanks and who do research and whatever, that then are very, very biased towards the tech companies.
Right.
I think really to think about the with the EU, and I still have hope because uh, in the past we've seen some kind of guardrails being put on, and in
Right.
particular when we look at even online and these social media companies, when it comes to child protection, when it comes to violent content and things like that. Actually, the EU has acted and
Right.
to kind of try to rein in some of these tech companies. Um, that's why I think they can still do it. My worry is with a commission that seems to be listening a lot more to the tech lobby than they are listening to us.
Well,
Uh,
but I really appreciate that you are showing up. I mean, I don't know if I don't think you would disagree with this, but I mean, I think it's really important, even if it seems like, you know, you're completely outnumbered, it's still important to show up and for artists and songwriters and people such as yourself, to be there, to
but
articulate that point of view, because otherwise they'll just roll right over you,
yeah, and
completely, right?
the copyright directive being a perfect example where
Yeah, exactly.
we
Yeah,
have been able to lobby hard enough. And I still believe, in particular, that EU members will, I believe in grassroots. I think I'm based in the UK, and we've had, because in the UK, they're still working on legislation.
right.
Um, the creative industry has been very much have had a chance to be in the forefront with the lobbying before they implement an opt-out TDM exception.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. The IPO, the Intellectual Property Office, had a request for information. We actually filed in that too. And a lot of these issues were being discussed, including this fantasy about robots.txt is going to somehow solve, your opt-out problem, which, is really a joke if you drill down on it. But what that seemed to have produced quite a bit of backlash across the board, right? In other words, I saw a lot of newspapers got involved,
Yeah,
right, and a lot of artists got involved. There was a substantial negative outpouring about the whole opt-out concept and AI kind of in general. Is that pretty
yeah.
much
I
what you
think
saw?
I was part of this is actually, and I'm quite proud of what we all accomplished and how we managed to keep it under wraps
Right.
before the day. So there was a specific day that was chosen where we would all kind of where across the board the creative industries would go
Right.
out with a strong um, campaign of protest. So what happened on this day? First of all, I was part of a project, the Silent album,
Yes.
which was
What was
basically
that?
the
Tell us
only
about
chance I'll
that.
ever get to make a record with Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel and Max Richter. But the where we said we made a silent album and said this is it's called "Is This What We Want?"
Right.
And it's basically that this is where we're heading unless we enforce copyright laws and allow music creators to decide if they want their works to be used for AI and also to be remunerated if it is. Because again, if we're aware that so much has already been hoovered out, and they might say you can't take the ingredient out of a baked cake, but you will still have to in some way remunerate the people who you have stolen from. So we had that, and all the newspapers, pretty much all the major newspapers, had on their front "Make It Fair." So it was the
Right.
same cover on each and every. There's like a picture of all of them sitting basically in the news agent, which is quite a feat when you think
Oh
we
yeah.
have some papers that are very far to the right and some that are to the left, and everything in between, tabloids. But every newspaper had that the same morning, and we released our silent record, and we had a lot of we had a public statement, and the government obviously had to respond in some sort of way, and the person from the government that is kind of in charge of this is the Minister for Science and Technology, Peter Kyle. Which already there we have a bit of a bias in where the regulation heads, but they said that they would definitely take the creator's view into account, and nothing would be done without the approval of creators. But
Which means they
since
won't get
that,
what they want. So that's probably
yeah.
not true, right?
But I will say this, and last week I was at another conference with the Independent Music Publishers Forum
Yep.
in Athens, and we had a representative from the Trade Committee in the EU Parliament speaking, and he said he was quite a busy guy after all the tariffs, I would say. But he did dial in, and he said there is still, even though there's a lot of pressure from American tech companies, he said,
Right.
in the
Mhm.
trade negotiations, he said that is really like the hardest push of all. And I leave it to everyone to kind of work out why that is,
Right.
and have a look at the inauguration perhaps, and the donors to the party, and the MEP, the spokesperson for the trade committee, was saying he still believes if we keep the pressure on the MEPs, on the actual representatives,
Right. The
he
grassroots.
and in the media, he
Right.
said,
Mm-hmm.
to consistency, and in when it comes to having these issues covered in the media is the key.
Right.
And
I
this
don't doubt
comes
that.
from the MEP in the parliament. So I think they know that there's a lot of pressure, but they also know that there is they have to represent their constituents.
Right.
And there's a lot more people working in the creative industry than in the tech industry,
Yeah.
and the ancillary industries across the board. So
Well,
I
speaking
think,
of the ancillary industries, have they on their side, has anybody really focused on the impact that all this AI hoorah is going to have on the electric grid? Because I mean, I've been
yeah,
watching the whole, climate change movement in Europe for a long time. And then all of a sudden, boom, we're not talking about that anymore, because there's no way I mean, we gave the example in our filing with the intellectual property office that in Oregon, there are 125 data centers in a
yeah,
geographical area about the size of the UK. The UK, however, has 16 times the population, which means that they have a lot more local demand, right,
yeah,
for electric, but they also are going to have a lot more people a lot closer to each one of those data centers, right?
yeah.
And to me, this is just like, are do they not really like? And they must know, right?
I don't
So
I don't
they
think people understand. I
really,
don't, Chris. I don't think that they the understanding sometimes. I mean, I'm lucky with my local MP where I live, that he actually, his father was a musician, um, and he understands, the issues that we're dealing with. But I think most elected representatives, A, don't understand copyright, and B, don't understand technology.
right,
And so they feel possibly more intimidated by not understanding technology than by not understanding
right,
copyright.
right.
So there is a tendency sometimes to kind of have that. And this is again like a deja vu of
Right.
safe harbor and Article 17, where
Hmm.
they don't want to be seen to being against innovation, or the sharing of information, and not understanding the ins and outs of it. And I think you're bringing up a very good point, because it's hardly ever talked about, the a vast amount. Even now, somebody told me that actually a Google search, which is a very light AI usage, is like driving a car, you know, 3 miles or something.
Oh
So
yeah,
be careful with what you, how often you Google stuff. But if
yeah,
you're an environmentalist, maybe use a dictionary or whatever, and it's like encyclopedia instead of Google.
right,
But it's something that is barely ever discussed, and I think also it's something where the government subsidizes a large part of the tech industry.
Oh yeah, and this is the other this is what happened. I mean, you can take Oregon, or I use Oregon as an example because it's got everything, all the problems, right? So why are all those data centers there? Well, they're there. One reason they're there is because there's this Columbia River Dam hydroelectric project, which was, from I think it was like the 60s. I mean, it's been there for a long time. But all these people want to be able to say that they run on clean energy, right? So they all have sucked up, the hydroelectric power in Oregon, and it's been gradually happening, I think, over the last 15 years or so. They went from maybe like one or two. Google was one of the first people there, and then now it's like, you know, Oracle, Facebook, it's just all of them are there, right? Amazon. And so you've got all of this, all these data centers there, which create a construction boom when they first get built, but then it takes like four people to operate it, right?
Yeah,
And they're using ever more electricity. So the local people who it was actually built for originally, and whose tax dollars, to your point, whose tax dollars went to subsidize most of it, right? And maybe in some parts all of it, now are getting crowded out, right?
yeah,
And they're essentially, these companies are coming in there and are essentially buying up all the electricity generation for AI. If you go to New York, if you remember the film China Syndrome, right? That what the real world event that prompted the China Syndrome was the near meltdown of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant
yeah,
in New York, right? Well, guess who just bought and is going to refurbish and reopen the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant? Microsoft, right?
yeah,
So, and they're not planning on sharing, okay?
yeah. Well,
They want that for them,
yeah, and
right?
then good luck to the New Yorkers. But
Right.
the
And this is going to happen
and
again and
we're
again
we're
and
close
again.
to Chernobyl,
Yes.
obviously. I remember the Chernobyl, which was something that was a bit
Yeah,
later. When we were
exactly.
like in Sweden, wondering where the wind was going to blow, if it was going to,
Right. That's right.
the wind has never been so important ever. But
Well, to your
they,
point though, I mean, I think that people, there's all sorts of aspects of this, like this opt out, just the functionality involved to really opt out. In other words, if it's going to apply to everyone, in other words, if you take kind of the burn approach, copyright, well, everyone, I mean, there's a lot of people involved in who are theoretically copyright owners, who on their Facebook posts, their websites, their book clubs, whatever it might be, outside of us, I mean, who
you're
make a living from it, right? And,
well, you're a
and
lawyer. You're a lawyer,
yes, and they're
and
stealing from me.
have they're stealing from you. I mean, I was
They
talking to
are,
a music lawyer over here at a Christmas party, and he was saying how they're trying to kind of restructure their business because a lot of their clients now, I already know several music producers that use ChatGPT for like smaller. I mean, they probably wouldn't use it for like a 3-year publishing deal, but they would use it for a project
oh
to
yeah,
save
sure,
money. And
oh yeah,
again, I think this is the thing when people, like, a lot of the time they kind of use AI. I've used ChatGPT because it seems to be the one that is the most used at the moment, at least amongst the people I know.
right,
And they say it's really convenient and everything, but they don't think of it how it affects them. And it's the same thing
right,
I heard somebody say. They it's great when I make a video because I can have it translated, literally, like translated into Japanese, and
right.
my voice will be speaking Japanese. Yeah, apart from the issue of like, how do you know it's saying what you just said?
Yeah,
It's a
yeah. Good luck with
it's a bit
that. Yeah, right.
risky.
Yeah,
But I
right.
was at a CSAC meeting last year, CSAC, not the American CSAC, but the
Yeah.
CSAC, which
We
is
say,
the
yeah,
umbrella
or we say
organization.
CISAC. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
the umbrella organization for CMOs, and some of their members are not in music; they're actually in visual arts or some other fields. And I ran into two women who were from the translators organization,
Oh my God.
who have
Yeah.
been completely, you know, they have lost so much work because they
Yeah.
were the first ones that were used by AI
Right.
in these in translations.
Well, that's what Google Books was. The Google Books was intent one of the immediate uses of Google Books at the time, right? Not recently, but at the time, was for Google Translate.
Yeah,
That was the whole point, because what they did was they got very high quality translations of a lot of books that have been translated into multiple languages. So, if you've got to translate, if you take like being and nothingness or something, right? And you've got that translated into 20 languages, you can be pretty sure that that's good quality, right? So they used all that to train their translation engine, which was kind of the cornerstone of their whole AI program, right? And that's
yeah,
why, when you look at these when you look at the actual metadata, the metadata is terrible, for Google
yeah.
Book Search. There was a guy named Jeffrey Nunberg who was a library scientist at Berkeley, who had this great article, which I've cited as many times as I possibly can, called Google Book Search, a Disaster for Scholars. And what he found was that there were all these, 1899 was a banner year for creative works, because that seemed to be the year they stuck on everything, where they didn't really want to take the time to actually do the metadata properly. Well, they didn't care about the metadata because they weren't using it for the metadata. They told you they were, but they were not using it for the metadata. They were using it to train their AI, right? They
And
wanted the text, and they're still doing it.
this brings us to the next step, apart from the code of practice,
Yeah.
is the templates. So there's a committee that is
And what's
working
that?
on the templates of what they need to publish. So this is an important part of the directive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think there's again this smoke and mirrors when it comes to what is copyrighted and what should be available, and part of it kind of caters to that argument that some people will say, well, what is the difference between AI and a human being
Right. Yes.
that is reading stuff and whatever? And of course, no human being ever reads hundreds of millions of books and memorize it and use it to filter through to their own works. You're kind of cutting out a little bit, so
No,
are you
you're
seeing
fine.
me okay?
Yeah, yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, great. So there's this thought that anything that is publicly available, you'll see that a lot. It's like, if it's
Yes.
publicly available, then they should be able to hoover it up without permission. But just because something is publicly available, YouTube, it's still a license there, and everything that YouTube has is not licensed, even despite our Article 17.
Right. That's right.
And
Or the DMCA in our
if
case.
this was the case, why does OpenAI have a deal with The Guardian, which is not behind a paywall?
Right.
So there's a lot of mixed messages there.
So the templates
Because
are for
obviously
the
OpenAI
transparent.
knows that they would be sued
Right.
if they used articles by The Guardian. That would
And
trace
the whole transparency issue really is a liability issue for them. If you think of it, when you look at it through the litigation lens, it's like that's an admission, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think that they're sort of postponing the inevitable to a certain extent, but only if they get sued, right? And most people are not going to sue them. So
Yeah.
that's fascinating. So the templates is that the effort that sounds like it's an effort to standardize the disclosures? Is that it?
Yeah.
Or have the AI companies disclose what they have snarfed up? That would be a
Yes.
monumental undertaking in and of itself, right?
Yeah. If it would be specific enough.
Right.
I
Yeah,
think
right.
that this is
Oh
sort of
yeah. What was I thinking?
this
Yeah,
is,
right.
yeah, uh,
Yeah,
it's
right.
like a code of conduct would be great unless it has,
Yeah.
we encourage you to
We
follow
encourage you to be
copyright laws.
honest. Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Right.
I think uh the issue with complete transparency is, I think, partly also why legislators think that maybe we should just let this is too complicated.
Right.
To how would we license this? And we often get asked, how is this going to be licensed? It's so too difficult. Of course, the music industry has licensed unspecified works for hundreds of years already. If you look at public performance,
Right.
playing music in hairdressers or in restaurants and whatever, up until very recently, we had no idea what music was being played.
Right.
We would still have a license with these places. It still required a license to play music.
Right.
And then we'd different organizations apply different methods, but usually something called analog, which is you kind of base it on other usage.
Right.
The most important thing to us is that we do not devalue human-made creative works
Right.
by us having to compete with free.
Right.
So since copyright, this law still stands that copyright can only be assigned to human beings. And not corporations, at least as far as I know, then there's no copyright to an AI work if it doesn't have a human behind it. Of course, we then have to prove that it's completely made by AI. It's hard to know if somebody says that actually I created it, I used a bit of AI, even if they actually used AI 100%. But don't let the imperfect be the enemy of a solution.
Right.
So I think what we're looking at is coming up with a licensing structure that is intermediate until we have the technology to be able to have a more specific licensing structure. In the same way as we've done with public performance, now we're able to actually have little technology put in venues that can trace what has been played. But in the meantime, we just have to make sure that we don't devalue creative works.
Right. Although I have to tell you that the idea that these companies can't just spit out what they've been, training on is remarkable to me. The sentence, Google can't find whatever, is it's insane.
I've never seen it. And this is a side note, but when we had our winter conference at ECSA, and just we're an umbrella organization for all European songwriter organizations. So we have
Right.
a committee for pop songwriters, a committee for media composers, and a committee for classical and jazz composers. And I'm heading the Songwriter committee. And our Finnish member said that he had tried to use a copyrighted work, a copyrighted article, and put it into DeepSeek and said, could you kind of squeeze this into 3 paragraphs? And DeepSeek said, we can't use this work because it's copyrighted. He put it into OpenAI, no problem at all.
No problem.
Yeah, isn't that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
It's an interesting point. I'm not saying that the Chinese are following copyright law better than the Americans, but it says something about OpenAI, probably more than, but also that if DeepSeek, with its kind of cheap technology, can trace copyrighted works.
Yeah. Well, they also, another way to look at that is maybe you had to be more clever about how you ask the question, because they're saying, wait a minute, we're not suckers over here, you know. We're not going to fall for that. But whatever.
Yeah, but
I take your
OpenAI
point,
doesn't care.
Yeah, it doesn't care. That's exactly
no.
it. That's exactly it. They don't care. They never have, and they never will. And that's, you know, they have to be dragged kicking and screaming. You know, I always say the only thing that they fear, that they really fear, is either an injunction, permanent injunction, or prison, one or the other, because it affects their behavior. Because if it's a question of paying money, they have more money than, you know, right? I mean, it's money's not an issue.
When has any of these companies ever been put in prison?
Never, right? But there's a first time for everything. But there's yeah, I mean, this is the other problem with this is that it is becoming kind of a national security argument that they're making. You know, I'm assuming they're doing the same over there, which is, well, you know, we can't fall behind the Chinese. I mean, there's all this regulation. I mean, one of the points we were trying to make was like, copyright is not regulation. Okay, it's not the same thing. Don't call it regulation, because it's not, right? But that's what they're trying to do. These regulations, regulations, yeah, they're getting in the way. Bureaucracy, right?
Well, and I think it comes back again to the greed.
Oh yeah.
Because in reality, it's the same as, you know, we want to enforce copyright not to stop people reading or listening to our music, but for us to have a say, how it's used.
Yes.
Because we're in the music industry, photographers and actors. I mean, actors and politicians, when it comes to AI, you want to have the right to decide how your likeness and your work is being used, but also to get remunerated.
It's a very big part of the
union. This is what copyright has always been about.
Yeah.
This is why I always get back to how copyright is the engine of free speech, for example.
And the union issues, the union strike, the actors strike, in Hollywood, those issues were all a very big part of it, because, you know, the studios, and this is, you hear this, it's like, they'll say, well, you know, some of our members may want to use it. It's like, well, yeah, that's right. You know, you may want to actually never hire another actor, right? You know, you're probably not going to go that far yet, you know.
Well, you know, we can see a parallel with the music industry and record labels, perhaps.
Yes, exactly.
You know,
and I heard that the Gecko guy, the guy who did the voiceover for the Gecko in the Geico ads, I don't know if you've seen those, but you know, the Geico Gecko, but
hard to miss.
But that guy apparently and I don't know if this is true, so don't hold me to this, but I believe it's true. That guy got a buyout so they could use AI to do whatever they want forever.
Oh, it does. That doesn't surprise me. There are a lot of contracts now, and I would say to any music creator out there that read the fine print.
Hmm.
I've been told that, for example, the independent distributors have injected a clause into their terms of use that say that you agree to your data being used.
Right.
And your data, remember, your music is called data in this sense. And
Yeah.
and of course, if you think about what if somebody has done a cover of a song and uploads it and uses an independent distributor, they don't have the right to give that permission when it
Right.
comes to composition.
Right. Yeah. They're
But
blowing
again,
past a lot of these. They're blowing past a lot of these things. I mean, even you look at Creative Commons, right? For example, almost every search of in ChatGPT or Copilot that I've done that involved, tell me about thus and such, right? I use it for that a lot. It's like if there's something I'm just hearing about for the first time, I'll say, well, tell me about thus and such. And by the way, it always seems to know. But what comes back is almost always Wikipedia. Well, Wikipedia is under a Creative Commons attribution license. No attribution.
mhm.
Very often it's the only way that it's from Wikipedia is if you go to the sources and you look at this, and you have to ask to look at the sources. I don't call that attribution, right?
No, and it's the interesting point about that is also alternative facts. How are you gonna know
Yes,
what unless you know the source?
right.
As somebody who has written work for the Guardian, the source is really, really important.
Yep.
And the source is important in when you publish an article that you say what the source is, not only for attribution, but for believability.
Yes. And the weight to be assigned. Because and you make a good point, because when this comes back, when it gets spit out from ChatGPT or whatever, it doesn't say, well, Wikipedia, which is a
Yeah.
dubious source, is not unlike the you know um, something out of 1984
Mm.
says. They don't say that. It just comes back as a factual statement, right?
Yeah. And then you can also look at the another aspect of it, and it's the bias
Yes.
in the whatever OpenAI and ChatGPT is spitting out already, because it's so frequently, well, it's at the top of Google. Um,
Right.
it kind of by most people is seen as fact,
Yes. And
and in
there's
the
also a
end, it
feature.
can only be it is all based on data. If you don't know what the data sets are, um, you don't know uh, how biased that information is.
That's right. Well, listen, thank you very much. I think we should probably call it. We could go on all afternoon,
Oh yeah, well, we got on to like just something that was even much wider than the music industry,
Yeah.
but I think it's important. What I do want to make clear is that
Yes.
it is so important to speak up
Mhm.
and to contact your local, if you're in the US, whoever your representative is for Congress, and say, this is my concern, and why you have that concern, because it does make a difference.
Yeah.
Don't ever think it doesn't. And having had the experience of going into the European Parliament and speaking to legislators, I know it makes a difference when we as creators speak up, and they like actually hanging out with creators a lot more than they like hanging out with tech pros. in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
And
I wonder why that is. Yeah. Right.
I wonder why that is. And they, most of them like music and like the creative arts. And we it's important for all of us that American creators also speak up. I I haven't seen enough of it, I think, in the
Yeah.
way that we had it in the UK, and in the way that it's being discussed in the EU now, from organizations. And that's clearly also because that we have this legislation that is being hammered out. On our AI panel, we also had actors, a representative, the chief legal for the Pan-European Actors Union.
Oh,
And he was even more angry about the code of conduct than I am. And I think there are so many of us that are being affected, and we need to really, really keep the pressure on,
yeah. It
because
really is a
it's
global
happening
thing.
now.
Yeah.
It's not happening next year or the year after. It's
That's right.
happening now.
Right this minute. As a matter of fact, as we speak, they're introducing the No Fakes Act in the U.S. Congress, which is we'll put in the show notes. But it's it's there's legislation going on all the time. I mean, it may not pass necessarily, but the discussions are being had all over the world, all over the
Yeah,
world. And your experience has been great, to hear about, because this is the kind of thing that they're not just doing it there, right? Or they're the global lobbying effort of all of these companies, the richest corporations in commercial history. Okay, their lobbying effort is global. It's like nothing we've ever seen
yeah.
before, right? And
And let
if we lose this, we're going to seriously be behind the eight ball, right?
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing too,
Sure.
that because some legislators say, well, if we say no, then they will just set up their business in Singapore or Japan that have passed very loose
Right.
laws when it comes to AI. But what is important is access to market. And
Right.
this is what we're pushing in the EU. If you want access to 600 million people, which is what you get within the EU, you need to abide by EU laws,
Right.
including EU copyright laws. So it doesn't matter where you set up your data centers and where you ingest
You can't forum
this
shop.
information.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
you will not have access to our market.
Which is a really important point, because they in this particular case, all of the big players are the same, right? It's not like, I mean, there might be like a couple of differences, but OpenAI is the same OpenAI here as it is there. They're not going to have a different data set there than they do here. It's all, so at the end of the day, you can look at it as a race to the bottom, or you can look at it as an important uh, uh, a legally important event to get your laws as restrictive as possible and as protective, or said another way, as protective of copyright as possible, because they're going to have to comply with the strongest set of laws at the end of the day. It's not really necessarily a race to the bottom, it's a race to the top, because it's the same data set, right? So they
Yeah,
can't, you know,
and this is what for example with our Article 17, the UK is not in the EU anymore, but obviously since you have Article 17 within the EU, the same applies in the UK.
right,
GDPR applies in the UK, even though that is an EU
right,
law, because we first of all, we proved that they can do it. If somebody can prove that the internet still works,
Yes, the
even
sun
though
still
they have to
rise. Yeah.
pay to get their data, then we have raised the bar for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And good on you. Well, so let's call it there. Where do people get in touch with you if they want to follow your work? And do you have, are you on, you're on Twitter? What's your Twitter
Well,
handle?
X it's called now. I'm not
X,
as
yes.
active on X. I'm active on Blue Sky, which
Ah, Blue Sky. So what's the story
yeah,
there? What's your handle there?
and Instagram and LinkedIn. So I'm when it comes to Instagram, it's Helienne Official,
Okay.
and on X, though I don't post a lot there anymore because I find it a complete sewer. Um, I'm under my first name, so
Okay.
I'm
All right.
quite easy to find because
Okay,
I
great.
think there's like one other Helienne out there.
All right.
So
Well,
even if you
good.
don't remember my last name, as long as you remember my first one.
All right, good. Well, we'll put all this in the show notes. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. And we'll if there's anything you want me to post, anything written you want me to post along with this, we'll just send it over and we'll do it. Okay.
Great.
All
Thank you
right.
so much. Thank you for having me,
All
Chris.
right. My pleasure. Thank you. Take care.